The twin suns of Rethvor hung low in the sky, casting an amber glow over the vast desert training grounds. The air shimmered from the intense heat, distorting the distant dunes into mirages that flickered like ghosts. Warriors stood in formation, their broad, muscular bodies clad in ceremonial training garb, awaiting the commencement of the Trial of Scorching Sands. The annual event was not just a test of endurance, it was a rite of passage, a brutal measure of a warrior's ability to withstand suffering without yielding to weakness. For generations, the Rethvor had taken pride in their unparalleled pain tolerance. They were a species of towering, reptilian humanoids with thick, scaled hides that deflected minor wounds like armor. Their nerve endings were dulled compared to most other known races, allowing them to endure injuries that would incapacitate weaker beings. From the moment a Rethvor child took his first steps, he was conditioned to embrace hardship as an honor, to treat agony as a companion rather than an enemy. By the time he reached adulthood, he could walk barefoot across scorching sand, take wounds without anesthesia, and train in temperatures that would kill most species within hours. Today, the warriors gathered before High Commander Zarek, a veteran of countless battles, whose body bore the scars of past wars like a map of suffering. He paced before them, his heavy footfalls sending small clouds of sand into the air. His sharp golden eyes surveyed the soldiers standing before him, searching for any flicker of hesitation. He found none. The trial was sacred, and to show doubt in its presence was to invite dishonor. Jirak's deep voice rumbled through the dry air. The trial of scorching sands is upon us once more. You stand here today as warriors of Rethvor, ready to prove that pain is nothing but an illusion, that endurance is our birthright. He folded his massive arms across his chest. This year, we welcome an outsider into our ranks. A murmur rippled through the assembled soldiers. An outsider? That was unheard of. The trial had always been a test for their own kind, not for weak-skinned aliens who relied on artificial medicine and fragile bodies. Some warriors exchanged glances, skeptical, their ridged brows furrowed in disbelief. Who would be foolish enough to challenge them on their own ground? Jirak turned toward the approaching figure, and the murmurs died down as all eyes fell upon the small, unfamiliar shape striding toward them. A human. Lieutenant Mia Wilson walked with measured steps, her boots kicking up small puffs of sand as she approached the Rethvor assembly. Her frame was lean, her skin pale against the deep golds and reds of the desert. Unlike the towering warriors before her, she had no natural armor, no thick hide to shield her from the elements. Her body was wrapped in light desert gear, designed more for maneuverability than protection. A canteen hung from her belt, alongside a small pouch containing emergency rations and a roll of medical bandages. Nothing more. Silence stretched across the training grounds as the warriors observed her with open skepticism. She met their gazes one by one, unflinching. She had expected this reaction. To them she must have looked like a fragile creature, an anomaly in a world of hardened warriors. But she knew better. Zarak gestured toward her. Lieutenant Mia Wilson of the Human Defense Corps has volunteered to partake in our sacred trial. She does not do this for glory or for spectacle. She does this to honor the bond between her kind and ours. She will walk the sands alongside you, endure what you endure, face what you face. His golden eyes flicked across his warriors. You may think her unfit. You may believe she will fail, but let it be known, if she endures, she will have earned the right to stand among you as an equal. A warrior from the front ranks, Captain Thrawn, stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow over Wilson. His dark green scales caught the sunlight, making him appear even more imposing. His voice was deep, laced with skepticism. Commander, with all due respect, she is human. She does not know true pain. He glanced down at her, narrowing his eyes. We have spent our lives mastering suffering. What does she know of agony? Wilson tilted her chin up slightly, her voice calm and steady. Enough to stand here. Some warriors let out hissing chuckles, amused by what they perceived as arrogance. Thrawn studied her for a moment longer before stepping back into formation, unconvinced but willing to let the trial decide her fate. Jurok nodded approvingly. Then let the desert judge her. He turned his gaze to the rest of the warriors. We begin at dawn. Rest while you can. By tomorrow, the sands will show no mercy. The assembly dispersed, but the air remained thick with unspoken doubt. Wilson felt the weight of their stares on her back as she walked toward the barracks. She knew she was being measured, tested, before the trial had even begun. She had spent years preparing for challenges like this, pushing her body beyond what was thought possible. But she also understood that this was not just a physical test. It was a battle of perception. No matter how much pain she endured, some of them would always see her as an outsider. That was fine. She didn't need their approval. She only needed to prove one thing, that humans were far stronger than they imagined. The twin suns had barely begun their ascent when the sharp sound of a war horn split the air, signaling the gathering of warriors at the starting grounds. The morning wind carried the lingering chill of the desert night, but it would not last. Soon the dunes would turn into a blistering inferno, and every step would test the endurance of those who dared to walk them. Mia Wilson stepped out of the barracks, her boots sinking slightly into the sand as she adjusted the straps of her gear. She moved with purpose, her gaze steady as she approached the assembly of towering Rethvor warriors. None of them spoke to her, but their presence alone was enough to convey their thoughts. She was an anomaly in their ranks, an outsider, whose very existence in this trial was an affront to their pride. That was fine. She had no intention of seeking their approval. She was here for one reason, to prove that pain was not a limitation. High Commander Jurok stood at the front, his golden eyes scanning the gathered warriors before settling on Wilson. His expression was unreadable, but the slightest tilt of his head acknowledged her presence. He lifted one clawed hand, silencing the murmurs that had begun to spread among the ranks. The time has come, he declared, his voice carrying over the shifting dunes. The trial of scorching sands begins now. The path ahead is merciless. Only those who endure will see its end. His gaze swept across the warriors, lingering a moment longer on Wilson before he turned toward the endless stretch of golden dunes. Move. With that single command, the march began. The sand was deceptively soft beneath Wilson's feet, shifting with each step, forcing her to adjust her balance constantly. The Rethvor moved with practiced ease, their massive frames unbothered by the terrain. Their thick, clawed feet adapted seamlessly to the loose ground, while their scaled skin shielded them from the sun's growing intensity. Wilson, on the other hand, had only her training and sheer determination to rely on. She kept her pace steady, falling into rhythm with the warriors around her. She could feel their eyes on her, watching for the first sign of weakness. The heat began to build, pressing against her skin like a heavy blanket. Sweat formed along her brow, but she ignored it. Hydration was limited, and wasting water would be a mistake. Hours passed, and the desert stretched endlessly before them. The wind had died, leaving only the sound of boots sinking into sand and the distant calls of desert scavengers. The first true challenge of the trial approached, a steep incline of dunes that would force them to climb against the shifting grains. Wilson tightened her jaw and pushed forward. The Rethvor warriors ascended with powerful strides, their weight allowing them to sink deep enough for stability. Wilson, however, had to rely on a different strategy. She lightened her steps, keeping her movements controlled to avoid sinking too deeply. It was slow, grueling work, but she did not falter. Midway up the incline, the first sign of struggle emerged. One of the younger warriors, burdened by the heavy weight of his gear, miscalculated his footing. He slipped, his massive form sliding several feet down before he caught himself with a sharp growl. Others turned to watch, but no one offered assistance. This was the way of the Rethvor. Every warrior fought his own battles. Wilson saw the flicker of frustration in his eyes as he struggled to regain his momentum. His breathing had become labored, the unrelenting heat sapping his strength. Without hesitation, Wilson adjusted her path and reached him just as he attempted another push forward. She didn't speak, didn't offer words of encouragement. She simply positioned herself slightly ahead, moving at a pace that allowed him to follow her steps. For a moment, he hesitated, but then he fell into step behind her, mimicking her movements. Together they ascended the dune, each step calculated, each shift of weight precise. When they finally reached the crest, he let out a slow exhale and glanced at her, his expression unreadable. She met his gaze briefly before continuing forward, saying nothing. The sun climbed higher, and with it the temperature became merciless. The golden sands radiated heat, turning the ground into a searing expanse that tested even the hardiest warriors. The march continued, the weight of exhaustion settling over them like an unseen force. Wilson's muscles burned, her throat dry from the relentless heat, but she refused to falter. Suddenly, a shadow passed overhead. A sharp cry echoed through the air, and instinct took over. Wilson dropped to a crouch just as a massive winged predator swooped down from above, its talons striking where she had stood moments before. The Rethvor reacted instantly, weapons drawn as the creature circled back. The predator was unlike anything she had seen before. A sleek, obsidian-feathered beast with wings that spanned twice the height of a warrior. Its eyes burned with an unnatural glow, scanning for weakness. It had been waiting for the heat to drain them before launching its attack. The Rethvor warriors braced, forming a defensive stance. The beast let out a piercing screech before diving again, this time toward one of the warriors at the edge of the formation. He barely had time to raise his arm before the creature's talons raked against his skin, drawing a line of dark crimson. Wilson didn't hesitate. As the creature ascended again, she reached for the knife strapped to her belt. The Rethvor were built for brute strength, but she had speed. She waited, her body coiled like a spring, eyes locked onto the predator as it prepared for another strike. The moment it dove, she moved. With a burst of agility, she rolled beneath its path, bringing her blade up in a precise arc. The metal met flesh, slicing through the membrane of one wing. The creature let out a shriek of pain, veering off course as it struggled to regain control. The Rethvor took advantage of the opening. With a unified roar, they launched into action, striking with lethal efficiency. The beast fought viciously, but the combined force of the warriors overwhelmed it. Within moments, it collapsed onto the sand, its body twitching before finally growing still. A heavy silence followed. Then, slowly, the warriors turned toward Wilson. She met their gazes, her breathing even despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. A few warriors exchanged glances, something unreadable passing between them. It wasn't quite respect, not yet, but the skepticism had lessened. High Commander Zurok stepped forward, his golden eyes studying her with newfound interest. "The trial continues," he said simply, before turning back toward the path ahead. The warriors moved forward, but this time, the glances they cast in her direction were no longer those of dismissal. She had earned their attention. Now, she just had to endure. The desert stretched endlessly ahead, an unforgiving expanse of shifting dunes that burned beneath the twin suns. Every step forward sent a ripple of heat shimmering off the ground, and the warriors of Rethvor moved in disciplined formation, their breath controlled, their pace unwavering. Mia Wilson walked among them, her body aching from the relentless march, her skin coated in a fine layer of dust. The heat pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating, but she kept her steps steady, her eyes locked ahead. She had no intention of falling behind. The landscape ahead began to change. The rolling dunes gave way to jagged, sun-scorched rock formations, their dark surfaces absorbing the heat, turning them into searing obstacles. The air itself seemed to thicken, the temperature rising to unbearable levels as the wind died completely. The warriors adjusted their formations instinctively, shifting their weight with practiced ease as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Wilson followed suit, scanning the landscape for the path of least resistance. Every movement had to be calculated. One wrong step on the loose crumbling rock could send her tumbling down the jagged slope. Her muscles screamed in protest, exhaustion creeping into her limbs, but she pushed forward. She had endured worse. A sudden movement caught her eye. One of the warriors ahead lost his footing, the loose rock beneath his feet giving way. His massive form tilted dangerously, his arms outstretched as he tried to regain balance. Wilson saw it happen in an instant, saw the shift in his center of gravity, the way the ground betrayed him. Without thinking, she lunged forward. Her fingers closed around his wrist, her grip like iron despite the sweat slicking her palm. The force of his fall nearly wrenched her off balance, but she dug her boots into the rock, bracing herself against the pull. For a split second she felt the strain in her muscles, the weight of him threatening to drag her down with him. Then, with a grunt of effort, she shifted her stance, leveraging her body to pull him upright. The warrior stared at her, his golden eyes wide with something close to disbelief. The others had seen what happened, their expressions unreadable as they observed the interaction. Wilson released her grip and stepped back, saying nothing. She didn't need gratitude, she just needed to keep moving. The rocky terrain stretched on, and the heat only intensified. The air became thick, suffocating, as if the very planet itself sought to break them. The warriors pressed forward, but even they were beginning to show signs of strain. Their movements, once effortless, grew heavier, their breathing deeper. Then, without warning, the sky darkened. A deep, guttural rumble echoed across the land, rolling over the rocks like distant thunder. Wilson's pulse quickened as she looked up, her instincts immediately on alert. A sandstorm. The Rethvor reacted immediately. They shifted their formations, adjusting their pace, their movements practiced and efficient. Wilson followed their lead, her mind racing as she calculated the best way to endure what was coming. The wind hit first, a sudden, violent gust that sent grains of sand slashing across her skin like tiny blades. She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay focused as the storm descended upon them. The sky turned to a swirling mass of dust and shadow, and within seconds, visibility dropped to nearly nothing. The wind howled around them, a relentless force that threatened to tear them from their path. Wilson lowered herself slightly, shielding her face as she moved forward. The sandstorm was merciless, each gust stealing the breath from her lungs, each step forward a battle against the storm's fury. The warriors around her moved like shadows, barely visible through the haze. A sharp sound cut through the wind, a shout, barely audible above the chaos. Wilson turned sharply, her eyes narrowing against the swirling sand. One of the warriors had fallen behind, his massive frame struggling against the wind as he fought to keep his footing. The others pressed on, their focus on survival. But Wilson hesitated for only a second before moving. She pushed through the storm, each step a war against the elements. The sand bit into her skin, the wind roaring in her ears, but she kept moving. She reached the warrior just as he stumbled, his body sinking into the shifting sands. Without hesitation, she grabbed his arm and pulled. He was heavy, the weight of his armor dragging him down, but she refused to let go. She gritted her teeth, planting her feet firmly as she strained against the pull of the storm. For a moment, it felt impossible. The wind howled, the sand shifted, and she could feel her own strength beginning to wane. Then, with a final surge of effort, she pulled him upright. He steadied himself, his breathing ragged, his golden eyes locking onto hers. She gave a small nod before turning back toward the barely visible silhouettes of the others ahead. Together, they moved forward. The storm raged around them, but step by step they pushed through. The minutes stretched into eternity, the world reduced to a chaotic blur of sand and wind. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the storm passed. The air cleared, revealing the warriors standing tall, their bodies covered in dust, their eyes scanning the horizon. Wilson exhaled slowly, shaking the sand from her gear as she steadied herself. The warrior she had helped gave her a lingering look before stepping back into formation. The High Commander stood at the front, his golden eyes watching her carefully. He said nothing, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. The trial continued. The desert had been transformed by the storm. The once pristine dunes were now a chaotic mess of jagged ridges and deep, uneven valleys, reshaped by the merciless winds. The air was thick with the scent of scorched sand, and a dull haze still lingered on the horizon, a reminder of the chaos that had just passed. The warriors of Rethvor stood at the edge of the ravaged terrain, their forms covered in dust, their expressions unreadable as they surveyed the path ahead. Mia Wilson exhaled slowly, adjusting the straps of her gear. Her muscles ached from the relentless march, the weight of exhaustion pressing against her bones. But she ignored it. She had endured storms before, had fought against worse odds. The trial was not over, and she had no intention of faltering now. High Commander Jurek stood at the front, his golden eyes scanning the warriors before locking on to Wilson. There was something different in his gaze now. Not approval, but recognition. She had proven that she could endure, that she would not break when faced with adversity. But endurance alone was not enough. The real test had yet to begin. He raised a clawed hand, signaling the warriors forward. Without hesitation, they began their descent into the newly carved valleys, their movements sure and precise. Wilson followed, her steps measured as she navigated the unstable ground. The sand shifted beneath her boots, forcing her to constantly adjust her balance. The heat had intensified. With the storm past, the twin suns had returned in full force, their relentless rays beating down on the exposed land. There was no wind now, no reprieve from the scorching temperature. The air felt heavy, each breath thick and dry. Hours passed in silence. The only sounds were the crunch of boots against sand and the distant cries of unseen creatures. The march continued, each step an unspoken challenge. Wilson could feel the dehydration creeping in, the dry burn in her throat a warning that water was running low. She rationed her supply carefully, taking only the smallest sips, knowing that every drop counted. Ahead, the terrain began to shift once more. The smooth dunes gave way to jagged rock formations, their dark surfaces shimmering with heat. The path narrowed, forcing the warriors into a single fill line as they navigated the treacherous ground. Wilson kept her focus sharp, her eyes scanning the terrain. Something felt different here, something unnatural. The air carried a strange stillness, a tension that settled deep in her gut. She had learned to trust that instinct, to recognize when danger lurked just beyond sight. A sound echoed through the canyon, a deep, guttural growl that sent a ripple of unease through the warriors. They stopped as one, their bodies tense, their hands instinctively reaching for their weapons. Wilson's grip tightened around the handle of her knife. She scanned the shadows, her pulse steady but alert. The growl came again, closer this time, vibrating through the ground beneath her feet. Then the attack came. From the crevices of the canyon walls, massive creatures emerged, their bodies sleek and muscular, covered in thick, armored scales. Their eyes burned with an unnatural glow, their elongated limbs moving with terrifying speed. They were predators, built for the hunt, and they had been waiting. The first creature lunged, its powerful claws slicing through the air toward the nearest warrior. The Rethvor reacted instantly, their weapons drawn, their movements swift and precise. The battle erupted in a blur of motion, steel clashing against bone, roars of fury mixing with the screeches of the beasts. Wilson moved without hesitation. One of the creatures charged toward her, its massive form closing the distance in seconds. She sidestepped at the last moment, her blade flashing as she drove it deep into its side. The beast let out a shriek of pain but did not falter. It twisted sharply, its claws raking across her shoulder, tearing through fabric and flesh. Pain exploded through her arm, but she gritted her teeth, forcing herself to move. She used the momentum of the creature's own attack, rolling beneath it and driving her knife into the soft spot beneath its jaw. This time it collapsed, its body twitching before falling still. She barely had time to recover before another beast lunged. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she pushed forward, dodging, striking, moving with calculated precision. The battle raged on, the warriors of Rethvor fighting with relentless efficiency. Blood stained the sand, the air thick with the scent of iron and burning flesh. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. The last of the creatures fell, its massive form crumbling into the dust. Silence settled over the canyon, broken only by the heavy breathing of the warriors. Wilson wiped the sweat from her brow, her hands slick with blood. Some of it hers, most of it not. She could feel the wound on her shoulder throbbing, but she ignored it. The pain was irrelevant. High Commander Zurok stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over the aftermath before settling on Wilson. For the first time, there was something resembling respect in his golden eyes. "The trial continues," he said, his voice steady. Wilson nodded, adjusting her grip on her knife. She had survived the storm. She had survived the beasts. But the hardest part was still ahead. The sun hung low on the horizon, casting long shadows across the battered landscape. The battle had left its mark, not just on the land, but on every warrior who had fought through it. Blood stained the sand in deep crimson patches, and the scent of scorched flesh lingered in the dry air. The Rethvor warriors stood in weary silence, their bodies marked with wounds, their breaths heavy. Mia Wilson remained among them, her knife still gripped in her hand, her shoulder burning from the gash she had sustained. But she was standing. That was what mattered. High Commander Zurok stepped forward, his golden eyes scanning the aftermath of the fight before shifting toward the warriors. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone commanded attention. He did not speak immediately, letting the weight of what had transpired settle over them. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm, steady. "The trial is not yet over." A few of the younger warriors stiffened, their exhaustion evident. They had fought, bled, endured, but the end was not yet within reach. Wilson did not react outwardly, though she felt the weight of the words settle in her chest. She had known this would not be simple. If it had been, it would not have been a true test. Zurok turned, pointing toward the towering cliffs in the distance. The jagged rocks stretched high into the sky, their sharp edges illuminated by the fading light. "The final ascent awaits. Only those who reach the summit will have completed the trial." There was no hesitation. The warriors fell into formation, their movements sharp despite the fatigue weighing them down. Wilson followed suit, her breathing measured, her focus unwavering. The climb would be brutal. She could already see the path ahead. Narrow ledges, loose stones, treacherous inclines. One misstep would mean a deadly fall. The first warrior reached the rock face and began his ascent, his powerful limbs pulling him upward with practiced ease. The others followed, each moving with deliberate precision. Wilson approached the base of the cliff, pressing her fingers against the rough stone. It was warm from the heat of the day, the surface uneven beneath her touch. She found her first hold and pulled herself up. Her muscles protested, the wound on her shoulder flaring with pain, but she ignored it. Pain did not matter, only movement, only progress. The climb was relentless. Every stretch of rock required a new calculation, a shift in weight, a careful balance between strength and strategy. Wilson moved with steady determination, her breathing controlled. The Rethvor warriors climbed ahead of her, their powerful frames making the ascent seem almost effortless, but she did not allow herself to feel inferior. She had come this far. She would not fail now. Halfway up the cliff, a sudden cry echoed through the air. Wilson turned her head just in time to see one of the warriors lose his grip. His body twisted violently as he struggled to regain control, his claws scraping against the rock. But the ledge beneath him crumbled. Without thinking, Wilson shifted her weight and pushed off the nearest ledge, closing the distance between them in an instant. Her fingers caught his arm just as he slipped, her grip ironclad despite the burning in her muscles. The force of his fall nearly pulled her down with him, but she dug her boots against a narrow foothold, using every ounce of strength to hold on. For a moment he simply stared at her, his golden eyes wide with shock. The idea that a human, someone without the natural strength of the Rethvor, had caught him seemed impossible. But Wilson did not let go. With a sharp exhale, she tightened her grip and pulled. The warrior gritted his teeth, his powerful limbs finding purchase once more. With her assistance, he hauled himself back onto the ledge, his breathing ragged. He looked at her, his expression unreadable, then gave a sharp nod before continuing his climb. Wilson wasted no time. She adjusted her stance and resumed her own ascent. The cliff seemed endless, the peak always just out of reach, but she did not falter. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, every muscle in her body screaming for relief. But she did not allow herself to stop. Then, finally, the summit came into view. The first warrior reached the top, pulling himself onto solid ground before turning to watch the others follow. One by one they reached the peak, their bodies marked with exhaustion but their eyes burning with determination. Wilson reached the final ledge and pushed herself upward. Her fingers gripped the edge, her body trembling from exertion, but she refused to fail now. With one last effort, she pulled herself onto the summit and rolled onto her back, staring up at the darkening sky. Silence stretched across the peak as the last of the warriors arrived. They stood together, battered but unbroken. The trial was over. High Commander Zarek stepped forward, his gaze sweeping over those who had endured. His golden eyes met Wilson's, and for the first time, something shifted in his expression. It was not just recognition, it was respect. The trial has ended, he said. His voice carried a weight that settled over them like a final judgment. You have endured. You have proven yourselves worthy. He paused, his gaze lingering on Wilson. Even those who were not born among us. A murmur rippled through the warriors, but none spoke against his words. She had fought beside them. She had bled beside them. She had not faltered when others would have fallen. That was enough. Wilson pushed herself to her feet, standing among them, her breath steady despite the exhaustion clawing at her. She had not come for their approval, but she had earned it. The suns dipped below the horizon, casting the desert in a wash of crimson and gold. The trial was over. She had won.